welcome. I'm very, very happy this afternoon to be speaking with um, both an instructor or a former instructor of McDaniel College and a scholar and researcher and teacher in her own right, Dr. Edith Frenyó. Welcome, Edith.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to
be
virtually here.
Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about where you are and what you do to put our conversation into context. Edith Frenyó is the Steinberg postdoctoral fellow at McGill in Montreal, and she specializes in migration and law. So you're an expert in international law and migration, and I should note that Edith gave a wonderful January term course on the Budapest campus of McDaniel College. I guess it was 2.5 years ago?
I think that was 2016, so it's been 4 years almost. Okay. Yeah, 4 years actually.
Time flies. And that course was on children and migration and what international law tells us about that. So we're really lucky to have you with us this afternoon. And I'd like to open up a conversation with you about the COVID-19 outbreak and what's happening in migration and movement and so on, because of course we've been seeing some radical changes in the last month and a half. I think maybe it's easiest to start with what's happening here in Europe. One of the very striking and dramatic developments of the last 2 months is the closure of borders within the Schengen zone, or at least radical changes to the laws regarding passing over those borders. And I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg. Could you say a little more about what's been happening, not only here, but in North America and around the world in terms of borders and movement?
Yes, so the global pandemic, which experts have been preparing for, of course, for many years, and it's been in sort of the intellectual and research bloodstream that something like this was going to happen, and that it's going to have a impact that is similar and yet different from former pandemics in the course of human history, which we've had many. We've had the so-called Black Plague and Yellow Fever, and most recently the Zika outbreak in South America. So it's not entirely new, but what is to a degree new is the level of global mobility and the way in which our social lives, our economic lives, the supply chain of production and services, and even our very intimate lives are so transnationalized and so folded into global mobility that, of course, that is a basic need for our sort of domestic economic and social existence is movement and migration. And it also allows for pathogens and pandemics to travel much more swiftly to the farthest reaches of the world. Mm-hmm. In many ways in previously unseen and unprecedented pace. So this is the moment in which this sort of hit us, a highly contagious disease, which is also deadly. So those two combinations at the same time proved to be very challenging. And there were sort of the International Migration Organization is tracking, and the UN is trying to track the ever unfolding patchwork of movement and travel restrictions that is going on globally. It's sort of hard to give, it would be impossible to give an exhaustive list, of course, not just because of the scope of it, but because it's sort of littered with various exemptions, various little caveats and corridors of movement. Mm-hmm. So I think one thing to understand that from a pathology and pathogen point of view, there's no such thing as a hermetically closed border. So border closures should not be touted as or viewed as a primary infection control or pandemics control measure. In fact, they have limited efficacy at very, very early stages of detecting a potential pandemic before it turns into a global pandemic. There is a sort of a way to isolate maybe a community or a cluster. But beyond that, it sort of comes fairly naturally along with other social distancing measures and other shutdown measures. So it's best when it's done gradually and with this global mobility in mind, because otherwise rapid, blunt travel restrictions can lead to dangerous bottlenecks of movement. And we saw that during the US travel ban. First, it impacted China, which is one thing, mobility was already tapering down on that end. But then when the blanket issuance of that travel ban was issued vis-a-vis the European Union states and nations, American citizens and residents overnight stormed airports in France and elsewhere. Thousands of people congregated in closed settings, which is the worst thing for infectious diseases, scrambling to get on planes because it wasn't clear to them initially whether they as citizens and residents are going to be allowed back in the United States in a feasible manner. So that just shows how hectic this situation was. And some countries did it somewhat differently. Canada took a gradual approach where I am. So Canada started hinting that obviously social and economic and academic activities going to be going online, and most events are going to be canceled, including conferences, because much of this, much like the pandemic influenza, this is spread mainly through business travel. So often the focus is on irregular or what's called illegal migration. Many of these diseases are spread through tourism, business travel, conference travel. Those are the clusters and hubs that were detected in Europe too during the ski season and spring break season travels. So as soon as we started communicating that those events are going to be canceled, conferences are going to be canceled, classes are going online, people started gradually making changes in their travel plans. So by the time Canada issued non-essential travel closures, so basically unless you're a Canadian resident, citizen, family member, and certain workers. So this is very interesting. So it didn't cause such a bottleneck because people had a time to plan, and there was a consultation with European partners, with partners across the globe. When that's not the case, there's more of a panic. But what's interesting is that, again, these travel restrictions are not, they are significant to our social life, significant for students who suddenly have to rearrange their whole lives, move back to their home countries if they so chose, or face social isolation in a foreign country and worry about health insurance access perhaps in some cases, or depending upon where they are. But it's quite interesting that there's so many exemptions, even under the current immigration-related restrictions that the Trump administration is proposing and pushing through. There's exemptions for essential workers. They are making additional exemptions around the world because there is going to be great food insecurity. So farming is hugely impacted by COVID, and much of our food production is dependent on migrant workers. Much of our care work and healthcare infrastructure is dependent upon foreign-born healthcare and in-home caregivers and institutional caregivers. So all of these travel restrictions came with many caveats, and from what I can tell, they will continue to carve out various zones of mobility. It is the same is true in Europe. There are one class of frequent flyers still moving with the limited way that Ryanair or any of the other airlines are still working. And that's, for now, it's farm workers who are lining up to help pick crops in various parts of Europe, and other type of temporary migrant workers that are essential and needed. So it just goes to show that it seems drastic, and it certainly reorganized all of our lives to a degree. We can't get a reasonably priced, safe plane ticket other than 3-4 transits and 45 hours of flight from East Coast to Europe, which is what it is right now. We can't really plan on our elite level of mobility, but on all levels, movement is still happening because the way our international economic system is organized, it's impossible for it not to be happening.
That is really, really interesting. And perhaps if we have time, we might explore further the degree to which border closures, or like you said, closures, really not the right word, but rules about the crossing of borders are coordinated or not between countries. But I do want to give some attention to what you have specialized in terms of your studies and teaching, which is migration and movement. And I wonder if you might say a word about what's been happening to major groups of migrants in different parts of the world.
Right. So there's multiple clusters, but if we just want to separate the two broad clusters, it's an unhelpful binary, but we still use it. Is sort of migration by choice, and it's often labor migration, professional migration, etc., personal family reasons, and what's called displacement and forced migration. And these are, of course, overlapping criteria, as we can intuitively know that, but oftentimes. But so on the one hand, labor-related mobility has been impacted, and I touched upon it a little bit in the previous segment. Absolutely. If you have had a work permit, for instance, approved prior to travel restrictions, you may have been able to get into the country of your choice of employment. After that, if approvals were scheduled for after that, most of those processes are on hold. Most of visa processing is on hold. So even if you've been approved for a position or a fellowship or a student admitted, it's a tricky thing to plan for entering certain countries where you need a student visa approved, because much of these foreign embassies and consulates are now not holding visa interviews. And not all of this can be done online, etc. So that's sort of the run of the mill. The other great cluster, of course, is forced migration and displacement. And the situation there has been quite tragic and difficult prior to COVID. So we have more people displaced, the majority of them internally displaced within a region, and then also externally housed in some of the poorest countries, the most economically challenged regions in the world, more than ever since the Second World War. So it's above 60 million people who are deemed by the UN to be displaced, and that's of course undercounting the total number. Huge number and percentage of children and women in precarious situations. They are in protracted displacement. So which used to be a shorter period is now on average 6 to 8 years and more in a displacement camp, for instance. So it's prevalent everywhere. There's this, most countries have begun outsourcing their asylum systems. So they are asking, they're wanting to make sure that people do not reach their shores or their borders, which is mostly the only way to claim asylum. I mean, other than the UN's relocation program, which is very limited, where a country can import someone who has been vetted by the UN and then vetted by their own homeland security systems or whatever else is applicable. But most of the people would have to reach a port of entry to claim asylum. And so countries have been in the business of avoiding that, of building up various external barriers and striking deals with countries, often with unsavory actors. Similar to this, the EU-Turkey deal has been a very similar attempt. There are any number of deals with countries in Africa and Middle East and beyond to keep people at bay and to keep people from migrating further to safer shores. So that's the underlying situation. What this means is most of these people, as COVID is hitting these regions of the world gradually, they are facing scarcity of resources. They're already living in cramped situations. So that's dangerous, obviously. Social distancing, 2 meters, 6 feet, it's hard to imagine in these conditions. You need access to washing hands. And this is, all of our media is saturated with commercials on what to sing and how to wash your hands. It's already been a challenge in a lot of these places, proper sanitation and safety. It is also a challenge in detention facilities for immigrants who have already entered the country. So there's a huge uproar in the United States as well with ICE detention, immigration and customs enforcement detentions, which are arguably unnecessary because the turnout rate at immigration court for undocumented migrants was above 90%. And then this administration decided to sort of impose blanket detention on all undocumented. They're a very, very narrow group of people who could be deemed in any way dangerous to society. These people are not criminal, even by crossing the border. In no cases is that a criminal offense. It's at best, a misdemeanor, and it's an administrative issue. And so what people are facing either in detention or displacement camps are cramped conditions, lack of sanitation, lack of access to safe working environments. So they are also ripe for labor exploitation. Be easily abused under non-fair labor standards because they are undocumented and in precarious situations. And aid workers are having a hard time keeping up with this. So the other problem is that, of course, all the major aid agencies, Doctors Without Borders, UN, and beyond that, Amnesty, all of them are trying to protect their own staff as well. So they have to make contingency plans and how can they be present in these areas? Can they remain present? And one example that might be interesting to Americans, the Peace Corps, for the first time in its history, halted all of its operations and had to en masse repatriate all of its volunteers from various parts of the world. And they are present all over. And it was a mass repatriation of American young citizens who had a plan also. Not only are they leaving behind situations where they were very helpful, but they also had a plan for their lives. And they entered a stagnant job market. With very little prospects to work, even in the service industry, which would be normally the place where they could work, with often no health insurance in the United States as American citizens, because it's tied to employment still in so many places. So it's a very interesting way in which all of these sort of the humanitarian family and community is connected in this, albeit with different consequences. But anyways, an already broken displaced system in the world in terms of displaced populations is heavily hit by COVID. And the studies and research is only taking flight in this as well. So we're not getting as much attention and news on this as we should, given the fact that we're focusing on our own national and regional COVID updates. So that's a quite tragic outcome, and so is for any precarious migrant worker, migrant caregivers, and domestic care workers. That's another cluster that I deal with closely. But
so really, it sounds like a double, if not a triple whammy, really, for displaced peoples. Now it's even harder to move at the same time. As you said, they're in conditions where the COVID-19 outbreak will be even worse for them. And that'll probably mean it'll be increasingly difficult to move. It sounds really terrible.
And just to add to that, but just to add to that, what we have to understand is the only silver lining from a migration studies and policy point of view that I see, which is a tragic silver lining, but is to say pathogens might be the only thing that teach us that if there's any cluster of human suffering that we systematically condone or tolerate, it will impact us inevitably, and there's nothing better than a pathogen to teach us that, because pathogens don't care about paperwork, they don't care about borders, they don't care about citizenship or nationality. We know that socioeconomically we are more fortunate, we have better access to healthcare, but with a quite deadly disease, we are also learning that we cannot, for long tolerate situations such as mass displacement, such as immigrant detention that is unhealthy and unsafe and in many ways unjust, such as the border situations that have developed along many borders of Europe, borders of the United States with Mexico, etc. Because as long as clusters of infections remain, of other diseases too, but especially COVID, it's just not going to be over. In fact, it will allow this pathogen and allow this disease a chance to mutate. And to come up with more resistant iterations. So as much as we're pushing for better treatments and vaccination elsewhere, it has to come hand in hand with addressing these issues internally and externally, and facing, these aspects of human suffering as our own business. So this sort of arm's length interaction we have wanted to have as societies with migrants or with refugees, this has to stop, because it was never right, but it is also dangerous to all of us as a human society.
It's not actually, so I think that opens up an interesting problem, which is what will, if anything, what will we learn from COVID-19 and this outbreak as it begins to subside a little bit in the next 6 months, the next year, the next 2 years? It's hard to imagine borders will be the way they were before. What, if anything, do you think is coming in terms of changes?
Right, so it's hard to tell in many ways, but it's a mixture of pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. Will we become a more compassionate world that understands how interconnected we are, and for our nation or our community or our family to be healthy, we must care about the other as ourselves, and so on. At the same time, that would be one good outcome. The other aspect is that we are understanding how essential care work is. Healthcare workers, in-home caregivers, and institutional caregivers in the elder and disability care field in particular. Much of our outbreak clusters here in Canada as well are concentrated in elder care and disabled care facilities. And a lot of the people working in these environments and working in in-home care are foreign-born, are migrant caregivers in a mostly formalized, sometimes informal situation, but mostly formalized situation in temporary work visa situations that they might or may not have a chance to turn into more permanent positions and permanent immigration statuses. That's different in every country. It's usually a very precarious form of labor. It's mostly performed by women. It's underpaid, invisible. That's often because of gender discrimination around this work. So, again, it's bringing these fields of work into the forefront. So it may lead us to pay attention to this better, to pay attention to the needs of foreign care workers more, and and build more solidarity. So that's one step. But we're also seeing a sort of alienation through this kind of physical, social distancing reality that we're all living. We're virtually connected, but the norm is to avoid each other. We are finding legitimate excuses to not talk to each other, to not interact. So it is simultaneously an alienating experience. The same thing in Europe, as you said, across the free movement zone, borders have been restricted. evidently movement is happening. There's corridors opening up all the time because, again, we're so interconnected that we have kids and relatives studying abroad, working abroad, having to move. Countries need to communicate on how to let a larger group of people in on one side and then hold up on another side, perhaps on another border. This is between Hungary and Romania too, is okay, we're going to let some people travel through Hungary overnight, maybe from Austria heading to east, then let's hold off on letting that many people in from the east towards the west. So there's all sorts of negotiations happening, but we are quite, you know, in some ways alienated, and there's a tendency to turn inwards and to say, see, everybody's back in their nests, everybody's back in their nation. Is it going to be a future of sort of nation states with firm borders, and is that keeping us safe? And again, I think it's important to show that, again, these firm borders are in many ways an illusion. So what could happen is, and what might be happening, is the same thing that President Trump suggested with regards to an immigration ban or restriction. It's not really a ban, to protect American jobs. Well, in fact, temporary workers are very much needed and are allowed continually into the United States. So what could happen is that we shift towards more temporary and precarious labor conditions and visas, that we start having a preference for not giving people sort of more of a membership in our societies, even though they are de facto members in our societies. They are exercising any number of forms of social citizenship. They are contributing. But it may lead to a tendency of wanting to develop any number of visa regimes that harp on the temporary nature, non-immigrant nature of these visas. That's already true in the United States. It's extremely hard to get a green card in the US unless you're married. I mean, really it is. People, I think, have a very little understanding of how hard it is to do that. But in any case, so that may be one outcome, which is not so positive, is that we sort of, for various populist purposes that sound good. Now, what's important to understand is these temporary workers, that's not protection of local jobs. In fact, if anything, it has an impact on the labor market, is having a lot of people who are expandable and only are in temporary conditions. Therefore, they don't have much political advocacy. Therefore, they can be discarded much easily, rather than an American citizen worker or an American resident worker, or, you know. So it's just to show that some of these narratives don't quite cover the reality. But again, with vis-a-vis Europe, for instance, and similar free movement zones, we will have to reinvigorate the free movement zone more and more. That's the entire reason of existence of Europe as an entity, or the European Union rather. But behaviors have a way of entrenching themselves. So we become path dependent. Institutions become path dependent. The longer we have these heightened controls and slower levying systems, the more people get used to it, policies get used to it, and it's harder to undo some of these structures that are seemingly temporary. Now, the EU does have legal regulations barring long-term blockage of free movement. So this is one of those cases when it's allowed, but it has to be temporary and it has to be in line with, in this case, the pandemic situation. So, you know, again, there are legal mechanisms built into the system, and I added some of the language in the memo on that. I don't want to get too technical, that would promise to make this temporary. But again, institutions have a way of getting used to a new normal.
I wonder, by the way, if there's anything you might say before we end our conversation about student movement. And I'm thinking about not just say McDaniel students, or for that matter McGill students, so many of whom are coming from other countries, right? But in Europe, for example, Erasmus students, right, which has become a very important and interesting institution that is, you know, part of the flow of people and things in the European Union. What do you think that the future of these things is perilous?
Yeah, so academia around the world is accustomed to, and in many ways dependent upon, foreign student movement. And it's not just in the STEM fields, which you would think are more convertible, you know, knowledges across the board, like, regardless of language, but in all fields, humanities, etc., law, eminently, especially in the postgraduate spheres. And masses of LLM students, of Masters of Law students, are traveling around the globe, particularly to the United States, but elsewhere too. One of the things that's important, I think, in conjunction, just to reiterate, is that local measures of distancing, of sanitary measures, of restricted interactions, movements, and so on, are much more effective than transnational travel bans. There's good scholarship to underscore that. So that's one thing to understand. So then the question becomes, is it feasible? You know, are we looking at each other as a one community that can respect these guidelines in whatever jurisdiction they're in? And in that case, other than making sure that everyone is covered health insurance wise, it shouldn't matter as much, other than for personal purposes, where one is. If they are a student, for instance, in an institution, they should, if all goes well, they can be accommodated in place. It's not a great social experience because you're cooped up and you have to adhere to limited movement, but you're around, you attend your classes, you don't have to worry about time differences, 6 to however many hour differences, which can cause trouble. They can cause trouble even within Canada. We've had some McGill students relocating to the other end of the country, so they have a 2-hour delay, which is an issue at an 8 a.m. class, right? So, but as far as student travel, that is, it's looking like it's going to take a hit in the immediate term. Much like it did after 9/11, much like it did at any time when there was for some reason a big overreaction, a big sort of reaction to foreign entity and to mobility. Now, but even in the domestic sense, we are going to be reorganizing how we do work and how we do leisure and all of it. So we're going to be experimenting, I think, with a mixture of physical and virtual presence. So this will be an interesting test to see. I mean, this is heartbreaking for, and I don't want to underestimate that, heartbreaking for students. I mean, especially those who are looking to graduate from high school seniors to college, to graduate and post, to have their semesters cut in half, for many of them to have to relocate to their home countries without the experience, the social experience of finishing with the cathartic experience of graduating. So it's a big deal. But beyond that, I think in the immediate term, I think the universities are already making contingency plans to think about the fall semester, because we're not looking at a normal year in this year and probably early next year to however long into next year. So even the next academic year will be impacted. So how much of education can we successfully move online? What consequences will that have for the social interaction aspect, the cultural exchange aspect of foreign education, which is a big part of this, of building bridges across cultures and countries and all of that, besides the pecuniary and financial concerns that universities have. What impacts does that have on tuition, for instance? Do you pay the same if you're not going to be present, but you're going to be a virtual student, etc.? So, you know, and there's limitations to this because in the STEM fields, you need lab presence. There are certain things you need to do, and you need to have the facilities to do it. So it's hard to see how all of this will be worked out in a world where international higher education is predicated on a temporary or long-term full degree foreign student movement. So that, again, I think institutions that are rather nimble and come up with innovative measures of moving online and negotiating with their respective governments to make sure that entry visas will be possible for their students when it becomes feasible to move in a safe manner of contact tracing, symptom tracing, etc. So once we can do that, it would be nice to see a resurgence of the movement of international students as well, if not so much in the fall, but let's see, can we do half of a virtual semester and half of a physical semester in the spring, or split 1 year this way, 1 year that way. It's tricky to see, but it is something I know that is on the mind of all administrators and educators, because we are not going to have a normal fall semester, what we would be used to. And that's a big thing to start preparing for already.
It's fascinating, and it's a universal problem, right? This is a challenge that institutions of higher education face, no matter what continent they're on. Well, Eddie, thank you so very much for your time today. And let me say before we sign off that I hope that, speaking of travel, you're able to return ultimately to Budapest and hopefully teach another Jan term at some point. The one that you gave in 2016 was extremely well received, and it'd be a real delight to have you back.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to that too. And I wish everyone all the best at the Budapest campus and at the main campus as well in this challenging time.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you once again, and all the best.
Thanks. You too.